Sky here with Smart Poker Study. Imagine having an unbeatable, long-term mathematical edge against your opponents. Well, that's what happens when you fold more often pre-flop than they do. And I'm going to help you do exactly that in this episode. Let's roll. Gambate! A common downfall that many of my new students have is the desire to play a lot of hands to see a lot of flops. But let me ask you a question. Who is your number one target at the table? It's the fish who plays too many hands. They just cannot help but call pre-flop with any pretty hand, open raise too much, or even 3-bet with too many hands. I came up with a new motto for poker: folding is boring, and boring is winning. So the idea of folding is winning, it is not sexy, but it's absolutely the truth. And the quickest way to improve your results is to play less hands than they do, because less hands gives you a mathematical advantage. But how do you play less hands than they do? You fold more often. So let's think about the VPIP, or voluntarily put money in the pot percentage of micro stakes winners. Most micro stakes winners VPIP less than 25% of the time, often just 15 to 20%. This means they're folding the other 75% of the time, or even more. And what about those losers that you target? They're VPIPing 30% or even more. So I want you to whip out Flopzilla if you're on your home computer right now and use the multiplayer mode. That's the button that you click on so you can enter multiple ranges against each other. I want you to enter just a 25% range, and you can see what this looks like. And then put that 25% range against a slightly wider 26% range. So what's the equity difference between these two ranges? It's really not much. It's a little bit greater than 1% equity edge. The 25% range has a 50.6% equity. The 26% range has a 49.4% equity. So slightly tighter is slightly ahead. But let's widen this gap a bit. Let's use that same 25% range, but let's put it against a much looser 45% VPIP range. Now this is interesting. The 25% range has a 55.3% pre-flop equity. The 45% range had a 44.7% equity. You have about a 10% edge when you play 25% of hands and your opponent plays 45%. Now the easiest way to play tighter is by using pre-flop ranges, and I created my KISS cash game ranges to help micro-stakes players fold more often to stay tighter pre-flop to give themselves that mathematical pre-flop advantage. These ranges especially limit calling in every position, and you're going to raise more often in the best positions. You can get the KISS cash game ranges from the show notes page, smartpokerstudy.com/pod494. Absolutely for free. Go there, fill out the form, download the ranges. Now, if you follow the KISS cash game ranges, your total VPIP across all positions will be around 15%. Now, what equity advantage do you have over the 26% and the 45% average VPIPers? Those two ranges that we already discussed. Well, now the 15% versus a 26% range has a 10%, a greater than 10% equity edge. The 15% versus a 45% range has a 19% equity edge. It's crazy to think that Vegas was built on a 1% edge across all of its games. You have a greater than that edge against your looser opponents. So playing tighter ranges than they do will lead to you winning on your poker journey. But here's an important thing. I just was talking about average VPIPing, right? So you might say to me, Sky, when I play, it's not my VPIP versus their VPIP. It's not my 15% versus their 45%. Instead, I raise and they call. There are different situations, so this total VPIP versus VPIP stuff doesn't apply. Well, two things to that. I would say actually that yes, VPIP versus VPIP is applicable, and it's useful because it highlights the equity advantage that your tighter ranges have versus their wider ranges. But now let's look at an actual real-world example. Let's imagine you open raise with a 15% range in the middle position. The big blind player, let's say that they defend with a 50% calling range. And now this is real world, 15 versus 50%. This happens all the time in your games. So what equity advantage does your 15% MP open raising range have versus his 50% big blind calling range? Well, if you put these into Flopzilla Pro, you're going to find that you have 61% equity. He has 39% equity. You have a 22% pre-flop equity advantage against this player. Plus, you have position. You are going to crush this fish in the long run when he calls your opens. But here's the thing. You might be thinking to yourself, Sky, I can't fold that much. That's too boring, and I don't want to be a nit. And I would say to you, you're right. Because as Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or you can't, you are right. If you don't think you can fold that often to give yourself that mathematical advantage, yeah, you're not going to be able to. You are your own worst enemy, and your inability to fold, that's what's leading to your losses. Now, I have a one-on-one student who limps and calls raises a ton, even though he knows not to do it. But his bad habit has developed from years of playing live, because that's what live players do, right? They limp in, try to see a flop for cheap. Somebody raises. Well, I got to see the flop still. I got a good enough hand. So then they call. It's a really hard habit to break. Now, my student, he's his own worst enemy right now, but he is working through it. So I'm going to give you and my student 3 tips to break calling habits. Tip number 1 is to believe that calling is bad for results. So I want you to whip open Poker Tracker 4 right now and find out your win rates for these 5 pre-flop actions. Number 1, raising first in. Number 2, 3-betting. Number 3, limping. Number 4, calling a 2-bet. And number 5, raising, then calling a 3-bet. Now it's extremely likely that you're going to be making money with the first 2 plays, the aggressive plays of raising first in and 3-betting. And you're going to be losing money with the last 3 plays, the calling plays, which was limping, calling a 2-bet, and then raising, calling a 3-bet. I've seen hundreds of student databases, and this is normally the case, winning when raising and losing when calling. So let this realization, let your own numbers help you to find more pre-flop folds. Continue raising the way you do, but the first step to folding more is calling less. And tip number 2, I already covered it kind of, use ranges, and you can get my KISS cash game ranges on the show notes page. And trust me, they're going to keep you tight, but they're going to keep you out of trouble, and they will give you that mathematical edge versus your micro-stakes opponents. And then tip number 3, be okay with being a nit. Too many students come to me and they say things like, I just can't fold here, that's too nitty. Or, I never fold this hand, there's too much potential. Or maybe they say, if I fold now, I'm giving up and they'll think I'm a pushover. Now here's the thing, you control your attitude towards folding. Don't choose to feel like a nit when folding. Instead, accept the idea that folding more leads to winning more. Now, one of the great things about folding is that your opponents, they don't know what you had. Maybe you opened with ace-jack and you made a tight laydown versus a 3-bet. They don't know you had ace-jack. For all they know, you were stealing with 10-7 suited. This nitty feeling that you have, it's truly all in your head. And because it's all in your own head, you can control the narrative. Plus, who cares if they think you're a nit? You don't know who they are. They're Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous sitting across from the table from you. What they think doesn't matter. So tell yourself, I'm folding because it's the best play, and this sets me up for future success while avoiding losses right now. Here's my challenge to you for this episode. Fold more. Take action on the 3 tips here to give yourself an unbeatable mathematical edge. Tip number 1 was believe that calling is bad for results. Tip number 2, use ranges. And tip number 3, be okay with being a nit. Now it's your turn to take action and do something positive for your poker game.